Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon a stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. 400 years ago, Shakespeare put those words into the mouth of his character Macbeth shortly after he had heard that his wife had died. But those words are equally relevant to us today. Before I answer or seek to address the question that we've come here to address today, how could a loving God allow us to suffer? I want to look just for a minute at the world if there is no God. And those words from Macbeth capture what your life and what my life mean if that is the case. If there is no God, then we are, as Stephen Hawking put it, chemical scum. If there is no God, then we are, as Macbeth put it, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Oxford's own Richard Dawkins said these words: "The universe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." That is the world that we are looking at if there is no God to say that you and I are more than chemical scum, that you and I are more than atoms and molecules, that we are more even than mammals. If there is no God, that is our world. It is nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But what if there is a God? What if there is a God who, as the Christian faith claims, is extraordinarily powerful? What if there is a God who was powerful enough to make the universe, to make the stars and the galaxies, to make you and to make me? And what if that same God, as the Christian faith claims, is incredibly loving? How can we hold those two things together? When we look at the suffering around us in the world today, when we look at the suffering in our lives, when we look at the suffering in the lives of those we love, when we look at the suffering that we see on the television screen, how can a loving God allow us to suffer like we do? I want to begin to look at that question through the lens of one story in one of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible. It's from John's gospel. Copies of John's gospel are on your tables if you want to grab one to take it home with you and read through John's gospel for yourself. And I'm going to be walking us through a story that John tells in chapter 11 of that gospel. And in that story, we hear from two friends of Jesus, Mary and Martha, who, if you were here yesterday, I mentioned the two of them, they're sisters. And I told the story yesterday of Jesus basically telling Martha off because she had wanted Jesus to tell Mary off for having the presumption to sit at Jesus' feet as one of his disciples. But in John chapter 11, Mary and Martha send a message to Jesus. And the message is this: Lord, the one you love is ill. Mary and Martha had a brother called Lazarus. And Lazarus had become very sick. But instead of saying, Lord, Lazarus is sick, they said, Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, Jesus was well known as a great miracle worker, a great healer. So when Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus got very sick, they thought, great, we'll send a message to Jesus, the great healer, and he'll come and help. John emphasizes to us that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother in verse 5 of that chapter. But then John says something very strange. He says that Jesus didn't come. In fact, Jesus deliberately waited until Lazarus had died. Now, this doesn't make any sense. It would make sense if it said, now, Jesus loved Mary and Martha and their brother, and so he came right at once, dropped everything, and ran to Bethany. Or it would make sense if it said, Jesus didn't really care about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he had lots of other things to do, and so he deprioritized them, and he thought, I'll come at some point, and unfortunately, Lazarus died in the meantime. But no, John tells us that Jesus specifically loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and so he deliberately did not come. If you, like me, are a Christian here today, you will need to reckon with the fact that there will be times in your life and times in the lives of those around you when you cry out to Jesus for help and it feels like he hasn't come. Remember in my own life a few years ago, I was going through a period of great sort of psychological distress. Nothing cataclysmic had happened, nobody had died, but I'd lost a relationship that was profoundly important to me, and I was devastated. It was in the summertime, and because I'm British, I don't cry very much. But my husband saw me cry more in the course of a few weeks that summer than he'd seen me cry in the previous sort of 10 years that he'd known me. And one day he'd come home from work, and we'd put our kids to bed, and then I sat on the sofa and started crying again. And being a good Christian husband, he sat down with me, and he opened up the Bible, and he started reading one of the Psalms. The psalm began, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. I just cried more. And I said to my husband, I feel like I am crying out to the Lord, and he is not helping me. But let's move forward in John chapter 11. Because after Lazarus is dead and buried, because Jesus waited for days and didn't come, finally, Jesus of Nazareth shows up. Martha comes out to meet him, and she says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give you. Can you hear this woman's faith? Her brother is dead, and yet she still thinks that Jesus can help. And Jesus gives her a theological answer. He says, your brother will rise again. Now, many Jews of Jesus' day believed that at the end of time, God would raise his faithful people from the dead to new life. But Martha hadn't called Jesus because she wanted to know that Lazarus was going to be raised at the end of time. She had called Jesus because she wanted him to help her now. And you can almost hear the disappointment in her voice when she says, yes, Lord, I know that he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. You could almost hear her saying in her heart, but what about now, Jesus? What about now? Why won't you help me now? And then Jesus looks into the eyes of this grief-stricken woman, and he says some of the most extraordinary and outrageous words that have ever been spoken on this planet. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Martha thinks that what she most needs from Jesus is her brother Lazarus back. But Jesus meets her in that moment. He says, no, what you most need is me. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Jesus is not just a means to an end. He is the end. He is not just the way to have a better life. He is the life. That is the outrageous claim that the Christian faith is making, that this first century Jewish man who died on a cross and was supposedly raised to life 3 days later is in fact the source of all true life. Jesus waited and let Lazarus die in order that he could have that conversation with Martha. And in order that he could tell her and tell us 2,000 years later that he is the resurrection and the life. But the story doesn't end there. Martha says, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's long-promised king who is coming into the world." And then she calls for Mary. And Mary comes out and she falls on the ground before Jesus weeping. And she says the same words her sister said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." If you open the book of Psalms in the middle of the Bible, you will find poem after poem of God's people crying out to God and saying, "Why are you not coming? Where are you, Lord? Help, 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 help." That is an appropriate thing for people to cry out to this loving God. Where are you? Why are you not coming? Help, help, help. And Jesus, in response to Mary, asked to be taken to the place where Lazarus has been buried. And then we see another very strange and surprising thing happening. We see that Jesus wept. Now, some of the people who are watching all of this unfold say, "Look how much he loved Lazarus. Here he is crying at Lazarus' tomb." But other people say, "Wait a minute. Couldn't Jesus, the one who opened the eyes of blind people, also have stopped this man from dying?" And the answer is yes. Jesus could have come. He could have healed Lazarus before he ever died. He could have made it so that there was no need for tears in this moment. And yet, Jesus in this moment weeps with Mary and Martha. If you put your trust in Jesus today, you're putting your trust in someone who will weep with you in your suffering. The message of the Bible is not that our suffering doesn't matter to God. We see in this story that our suffering brings tears to the eyes of the Son of God. And we will meet with Jesus in our suffering in a profound way. I texted a friend a few months ago to just check in and see how she was. And she gave me some really sad news that she had been diagnosed with a serious autoimmune disease. And I said to her, "I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." And I'm going to read the text that she sent back to me. This woman, by the way, is in her early 30s. She said, "I agree. But there is a redemptive power in my suffering that is transcendent. I'm closer to Jesus than all my days. There is a low life prognosis for my autoimmune disease, but the joy of potentially seeing him fills my heart with thanksgiving. He is all that I know, and I may finally be able to behold him." That's a woman meeting with Jesus in her suffering. Just like Jesus stood with Mary and Martha at their brother Lazarus' tomb and wept. But if the Christian faith only offered us a compassionate God, but not a powerful God, then ultimately we're still stuck. We're still stuck with our suffering, and we're still stuck with the inevitability of our death. But then the story goes on. Jesus tells them to roll the stone away from Lazarus' tomb. And Martha points out the sort of awkward fact that Lazarus, at this point, there's going to be an odor. His body is decaying. It's going to smell. Jesus says, roll the stone away. And then he cries out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And John says that the man who is dead came out. The same Jesus who wept with Mary and Martha, the same Jesus who had the power to heal Lazarus in the first place, the same Jesus who let Lazarus die, has the authority to call Lazarus out of his grave. I sometimes drive past graveyards with my kids. And I remember one conversation with my now 10-year-old Eliza when she was about 5 or 6, and she said, Mummy, is that where all the dead people are? I said, yes. She said, oh, that's gross. I said, don't feel too superior to those dead people. You're going to be one of them one day. But I said to her, if you have put your trust in Jesus, then one day when your body is dead and buried and rotted away, he will call you out of your grave. Eliza, come out. To her sister Miranda, come out. To her baby brother, Luke, come out. John's gospel tells us at the very beginning that the person who walked this earth 2,000 years ago as Jesus of Nazareth is also the Son of God through whom all things were made. And if the story of the Bible is true, and there is a God who made you and made me, it actually makes sense that that same God would have the power and the authority to call us out of our graves, however wild and crazy that may seem. And as the story of John's gospel goes on from this point, we find that Jesus isn't just somebody who meets with us in our suffering as a sympathetic bystander. He isn't just somebody who has the power to end our suffering by calling us even out of the grave. He is the one who actually stepped into our suffering in the most profound way. Jesus explained to his disciples that he had come not to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He told them time and again that he was actually going to a Roman cross in order to be executed, that this was not the sign of the complete failure of his attempt to be God's king on earth, but in fact, it was the place where he was going to win the greatest victory by dying that horrific, agonizing death. The Romans had specifically designed crucifixion to maximize torture and humiliation. They had designed it mostly to make examples of rebellious slaves, but also of people like Jesus who could be positioned as sort of political rivals to Rome. When Jesus died on the cross, the Son of the Creator God himself experienced suffering in the most profound way. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what the people you love are going through today. Very likely you're suffering things that I've never suffered. And whereas I could say I understand, I probably really don't. But Jesus is the one who has stepped into our suffering and taken it upon himself. There is nothing that you or I could suffer that Jesus cannot understand. But as he hung there and suffered on the cross, he not only took our suffering, our pain, our sorrow, our sickness, and our death, he also took our judgment. It's very interesting when you read through the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. Jesus had great courage in the face of his crucifixion, courage that I would never have had. But Jesus expressed profound dread at the prospect of the spiritual suffering that he was going to endure there, at the prospect of all God's righteous anger against human sin being poured down onto him, being funneled onto him. That was what he most dreaded. But actually taking that for us is what can offer you and me the greatest hope in this life or the next. Because we can come to Jesus with our pain, with our suffering, with our struggles, and with our sin. And if, like Mary and Martha, we throw ourselves down at his feet, he will lift us up and embrace us. He didn't just tell Martha that he was the resurrection and the life. He actually proved it, not just by raising Lazarus from the dead, but by coming back to life himself. Now, I know these are extraordinary, wild, miraculous, crazy-sounding claims, and I've tried in the course of this week to address some of the reasons why we might actually, even we, highly educated Oxbridge folks, I was at Cambridge, the other place, might take these claims seriously. But at the end of the day, the Christian faith is strange, bizarre, unbelievable. And yet I think it offers us the most coherent way of understanding our world today, not just rationally, but emotionally. Not just in terms of what we think, but in terms of what we feel and how we suffer. Because the story of the Christian faith is not of this detached, absent God who made the universe and then walked away. It's a story of a God who stepped into the universe in the person of Jesus and died a death that brought him into the deepest pain and suffering that you and I could ever imagine. And then walked out of his grave. I am the resurrection and the life, says Jesus. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?